We are into the NFL playoffs, and we'll be seeing the Super Bowl in a few weeks. I assume that the Chiefs will get there on one side because someone on that team clearly has a deal in place with the devil. And I'm sure, especially after last night, that many of us hope that the Commanders will be on the other side of that field. I may or may not have had in parentheses in here, make sure to apologize after mentioning that if they lost. But they didn't, so we're okay. But earlier this season, before they so graciously bowed out last night, the Lions gifted us with a fascinating example that kind of brings to light something in the sermon. See, at halftime of the Lions-Texans game, an account tweeted out this graphic saying that this was the 7th game where Jared Goff had thrown at least 4 interceptions, but his record in those games was 6-0. He had won every single time he had played terribly. It was a joke about, hey, maybe he has him right where he wants him as he's playing awful. The next morning, one of the biggest sports shows in the country picked up that exact graphic and proceeded to have a significant discussion of what factors might play into such a record, how unsustainable it was, what it might mean for the Lions moving forward. The problem was it was fake. It wasn't actually real. The account then sent out a video, a copy of the video of the sports show talking about their stat, and he said, by the way, I made up that stat at halftime while I was sitting on my couch. I made a graphic to go along with it, and it just took off. He used it as a way to caution folks about how fast falsehood can spread. As Mark Twain once put it, a lie can get halfway around the world before the truth can get its pants on. This morning, we're going to be talking about a biblical character who had an intimate relationship with lies, manipulation, and deception. We're going to zoom out on the story of Jacob. So we're going to cover almost 10 chapters of the Bible and at least 30 years of Jacob's life, looking at how his deceptive nature interacted with God's grace and covenant-keeping goodness. We're going to start by reading Genesis 25, verses 21 through 34. And Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife, because she was barren. And the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah his wife conceived. The children struggled within her, and she said, if it is thus, why is this happening to me? So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. When her days to give birth were completed, behold, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body like a hairy cloak. So they called his name Esau. Afterward, his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel. So his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. When the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man dwelling in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Once when Jacob was cooking stew, Esau came in from the field, and he was exhausted. And Esau said to Jacob, let me eat some of that red stew, for I am exhausted. Therefore his name was called Edom. Jacob said, sell me your birthright now. And Esau said, I am about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me? Jacob said, swear to me now. So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. And then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. We'll pause there. There are times in the Bible where it gives us a great big hint, a flashing neon sign about what the future holds for someone in the story, right from the word go. And we don't really realize it because homonyms don't translate. A homonym is when 2 words mean completely different things, but they sound exactly the same in the way you say them. So like in English, for instance, great can mean excellent, good, woohoo. Great can also mean rip or cut little pieces off of something. And grate can mean a piece of metal covering a drain or a hole, depending on how you spell it. But they sound exactly the same. But what happens if I translate those words into Spanish? all of a sudden, those three greats become excelente, rayar, and regia. They don't sound anything alike. Homonyms don't translate. Here in the story, when the twins first show up, Esau is a blazing redhead. He's got red hair all over his body. I had a brother-in-law who found out I was doing this one, who is a blazing redhead. And he said, you have to make sure to make a joke about how Esau didn't have a soul. And I said, no, brother-in-law, that would not be appropriate. But here I am anyway. And then the second twin comes out, and he's holding on to the heel of the first twin. So they name him Jacob, which means he takes by the heel. He grabs by the heel. Again, both of these kids are named after very literal, kind of the physical description of their birth. But there was another word in Hebrew that sounded exactly like Jacob. It had one little tiny difference from it, but you wouldn't be able to tell it if you were talking to someone. And that word meant he cheats or he deceives. We see right from the start in Jacob's name, and then we see it right from the start in Jacob's actions. Jacob was the smaller, the weaker brother. He learned in life real quick that he couldn't get things by physical force, and he needed to find another way to get what he wanted. So deception becomes that way. Jacob does what he needs to do to get what he wants, and he runs over anybody who gets in his way. When we think about bullies, just the word bully, what do you think of? You probably think of like a playground and the biggest kid punching the other kid to take his lunch money. But when we become adults, and I think even for teenagers these days with like social media and stuff as we're growing up, earlier and earlier, at least in my experience, the biggest bullies stop being physical bullies. They become social and emotional bullies. The people who learn how to manipulate situations and other people to get what they want, regardless of how it affects someone else. Jacob becomes a social and emotional bully. He becomes a master manipulator. He says, I am going to figure out how to get what I want, how to position things so that I'm in charge no matter what. We saw it in his name, and now we see it in his actions. The first thing we see after he's born is him taking advantage of another person's weakness. Now, Esau isn't faultless here. Verse 34 said he despised his birthright through his actions. Absolutely. But do you think in a million years that Jacob didn't know that? With all his deception, with all his manipulation as we go on, he knew Esau's weakness. He knew that he wasn't taking this seriously enough, and he used Esau's ignorance and his superior intellect and cunning to trick his strong but slow-witted brother out of what belonged to him. We have to watch out for this as Christians. This is a point where we can develop some real wisdom as we realize that while it's real easy to condemn those who are clumsy physical bullies, those who just kind of plow through like a bull in a china shop to get what they want, whether or not other people are in the way, we have to realize that intellectual manipulation and deception can be just as bad when we use those to get what we want, regardless of what others do. That kind of manipulation can be just as bad as the schoolyard bully giving you a wedgie to make you give him your lunch money. And if Jacob had given Esau a wedgie with the soup, he puts his head in the toilet in chapter 27. Jacob won't get let up. He won't let go. He keeps manipulating. He keeps taking what he wants from his brother. We're not going to read most of it, but I want to summarize chapter 27 for you. Isaac is getting old. His sight is failing. And again, Jacob, and this time his mother Rebekah, see someone else's weakness as the opportunity to get what they want. Jacob disguises himself as Esau through a number of different means. He cooks a stew that was like Esau's signature recipe so that he will smell like his brother. He covers his arms in goat fur so that when his father touches him, he will feel like his brother. He tries to trick what senses his father has left and to one degree or another, it works. Jacob succeeds in taking the blessing, and this time when Esau comes in and finds out what has happened, he understands what has been done to him and is not happy about it. So within a short time frame, Rebekah finds an excuse to, you guessed it, manipulate Isaac into sending Jacob away so that Esau can't harm him. Jacob goes to live with his uncle Laban with the ostensible goal of finding a future wife. I bet us millennials didn't know that the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air was actually just a retelling of a classic biblical narrative, the nephew sent to live with his uncle to avoid a dangerous situation in his neighborhood. All the millennials are like, yeah, and everyone else is like, John, please stop. So that's where we see the shift from, this is where we see a shift from us learning about Jacob's deceitfulness to learning about God's faithfulness. Let's read chapter 28, verses 11 through 22. So in verse 10 it says Jacob has left. He's on his way to Haran, the land of his uncle Laban. And he came to a certain place and stayed there that night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed. And behold, there was a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep, and he said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I didn't know it. And he was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. So early in the morning, Jacob took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up for a pillar and poured oil on top of it. He called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of the city was Luz at the first. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God, and this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house, and of all that you give me I will give a full tenth to you. And we'll pause there. So Jacob has been living up to his name as the cheater, the deceiver. He's been doing whatever it takes to get what he thinks is his, what is owed to him, and now he's starting to see some consequences from that lifestyle. So he flees, and miraculously, unexpectedly, unlooked for and unasked for, God's grace shows up in the middle of the desert. God says, Jacob, I have been the God of your father and your grandfather, and I will be yours as well. I will give you offspring and a land to be your home, and through your offspring the whole world will be blessed. God makes all his promises, and like with Abraham last week, he demands nothing in return. It's purely a gracious gift to Jacob. We get to the point where we'd say, and here's what I expect of you, and instead Jacob wakes up. God says, I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to give you these blessings, not because you deserve it, but because I love you and I care for you. And Jacob misses that completely. Just totally disregards the free offer of the grace of God. He has been making it work, making life work for himself. He has been doing what he needs to do to get what he wants for so long, intellectually and socially bullying others into giving him what he wants, that he wakes up and tries to retroactively put God into the same box he's put everybody else into in his life. Somebody to make a transaction with, someone to make a deal or manipulate and end up on the better side of the bargain. First, he makes it about him and the fact that he has found the secret God place. He says, it's about the place. It's about where I'm sleeping. I found the secret talking to God rock pillow. It's about me. I found it. Ha-ha, excellent. And so he sets up the rock and he pours expensive oil over it. He says, this place is the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. And he wakes up and starts trying to make promises to God that God never asked for, in exchange for benefits that God never promised. Notice he starts slightly when he restates God's promises, he starts changing and manipulating it. It's no longer is it God saying, I will keep you and bring you back to this place. It's now, you will keep me in clothes and food and my material comforts and then bring me back to the house of my father, which is not where he is right now. Yet Jacob keeps trying to say, oh, I'm going to fix this. I'm going to turn this into a manipulation contest. And I think it's really important for us all to realize that we tend to do this in life too. I think we have all had a moment at some point in our hearts where we have said, if you've been a Christian for more than a few years, you've had a moment where you've said, God, I have done X, Y, and Z for you. Now you owe me A, B, and C. Or where you say, God, if only you'll do X, then I will give you Y. We don't do it necessarily in the same terms that these folks in the Old Testament do, but we all have this feeling. God, I've been a good person. Why am I not finding the right romantic match for me? God, I've worked really hard on parenting these kids the way that you tell me to, and they're awful. I haven't felt that way. This is not a personal illustration. But we all have these moments somewhere in our lives where we say, God, I've done all these things, and you haven't given me what I wanted on the other side of this bargain. Jacob is not some weird, out there, oh, look at this lunatic. Jacob is a bigger version of what all of us do in our hearts sometimes. We try to manipulate God, and if somebody else is going to get in the way, it'll be better for them even if our plan is the one that works out. God has shown Jacob free, overwhelming grace, and Jacob says, no, I got this. I'm going to keep going. You're okay, God. I'm going to make this work. So let's get back to Jacob making it work in chapters 29 through 31. I'm going to summarize big chunks of about 3 chapters here. Jacob approaches Haran, the city where his uncle Laban lives, and he meets some shepherds at a well outside of town. He's asking about Laban, and they say, yeah, we know Laban. That's his daughter right over there coming down to the well, Rachel. So I imagine Jacob turns, and I imagine this sequence is like Jacob turns to look, and the camera slows down, and time dilates as he's looking over, and you hear this atmospheric keyboard and guitar start in the background. You hear, I just died in your arms tonight. 80s love music. Rachel's hair starts blowing in the breeze and shakes it back and forth a little bit. Okay, maybe that's not exactly what happened, but whatever did happen, Jacob is hooked. Jacob goes back to Laban. He lives with him for about a month, works with his shepherds, helping out around places. And then he goes to Laban. He says, Laban, I want to marry one of your daughters. And Jacob, the deceiver, the manipulator, the one who ends up on the right side of every deal, he doesn't just say, Laban, I want one of your daughters. He says, Laban, I want the more desirable one of your daughters. I want the one the world would look at and say, wow, good catch, Jacob. Way to go, man. You did good on that one. Jacob doesn't believe in ending up on the bad side of a deal, and he's not going to do that here either. But Laban's not half bad at this either. So he says, okay, Jacob, you're going to work for me 7 years, and you've got a deal. We actually know from documents in the area back in this day that the typical bride price would have been 2 to 3 years of labor, or what you would have made out of that. So Laban is asking for a big deal. Laban knows what he's got. And Laban says, no, you're working for me for 7 years. And Jacob's affection for Rachel was clearly real in some way, shape, or form, because for the first time in his life, he accepts a deal where most people would say, you're coming out the loser. He takes a deal where he pays above market price for what he's getting. He works for 7 years. He's excited to finally get married. But we find out that there might be a person in this story who's better at cheating than Jacob is. Because because Laban pulls a switcheroo, and in a culture where the bride is fully veiled throughout the wedding, and then you go to a dark tent for the night, Jacob wakes up in the morning and realizes that he's now married to Leah and not Rachel, the older daughter that Laban thought would be harder to marry off. Jacob is incensed. He's angry. He goes and screams at Laban, but he realizes that Laban got him on this one. There's not a way legally, traditionally, for him to manipulate his way out of this one. And so he's forced to agree to another 7 years of labor to get to marry Rachel too. Over those next 7+ years, shenanigans ensue. Too many of them to fully go into here, but I'll give you a quick Cliff's Notes. Rachel and Leah get real competitive about who can make Jacob love them more via childbearing, to the point of, in spirit, becoming their grandmother-in-law and giving Jacob their servants to have children as well. And then whenever one of them has a kid, they yell over, "That one counts as mine! That one counts for me! I'm winning now!" There's some wild stuff going on with goats and sticks, where Laban and Jacob are trying to they manipulate each other in who gets which animals from the herds as the herds multiply. And Laban tries to trick Jacob by saying, "I'll give you all of the less valuable animals who have like spots and blemishes." And so Jacob goes and tries to force all of the animals to have goats and sheep that have spots and blemishes. There's all sorts of stuff going on. Jacob keeps trying his manipulation game throughout these 7 years. But more and more as it goes along, he starts seeing that the game isn't much fun when everybody is playing. That it is a finite game. Someone has to win and someone has to lose. You can't win forever, and losing can be pretty devastating. It gets to the point where the stakes get so out of control that Jacob is afraid that one of Laban's other sons is going to knife him in the night. And so Jacob and his wives and all their servants and flocks get out of Dodge. They find an excuse to go somewhere where they think Laban won't realize that they've all left, and they bolt in the proverbial dead of night. He plans to go back to his father's house, his original plan all the way back when God gave him the vision in the desert. But shortly after leaving, Jacob realizes that he might not be as good at this game as he thought he was at the start. And Jacob is confronted with the consequences of his deception and starts realizing the amazing reality of God's grace. Let's read Genesis 31, verses 22 to 29. When it was told to Laban on the third day that Jacob had fled, he took his kinsman with him and pursued him for 7 days, followed close after him into the hill country of Gilead. But God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream by night and said to him, "Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad." And Laban overtook Jacob. Now Jacob had pitched his tent in the hill country, and Laban with his kinsmen pitched tents in the hill country of Gilead. And Laban said to Jacob, "What have you done, that you have tricked me and driven away my daughters like captives of the sword? Why did you flee secretly and trick me, and did not tell me, so that I might have sent you away with mirth and songs, with tambourine and lyre? And why did you not permit me to kiss my sons and my daughters farewell? Now you have done foolishly. It is in my power to do you harm. But the God of your father spoke to me last night, saying, 'Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad.'" Laban wants to show Jacob what's for. He wants to give him peace of mind. He wants to give him some consequences for his manipulation these past years. And why not? In the manipulation game, in the power and influence game of the world, winners win and losers lose, and them's the breaks. But God intervenes. Not because Jacob asked, not because Jacob deserved it. He didn't, and he didn't. If anything, Jacob is about to finally get what he is owed for the first time, the comeuppance for his years of trying to play the power and manipulation game with his uncle and everyone else. Jacob had figuratively fled into the dark of night with no thought to the fact that his father-in-law would never see his daughters or grandchildren again. And he doesn't get what he deserves for that. Jacob for years tried to intentionally decrease Laban's wealth in order to benefit his own, and he doesn't get what he deserves for that. Jacob had deceived and taken advantage of his brother, but as we'll soon see, he doesn't get what he deserves for that. Instead, he gets mercy. Instead, divine intervention. And it's so important for us to note, again, we're Jacob in this story. We're not a hero. We're the person running around trying to get what we want. And this is how God treats each and every one of us. In the scripture that we read before the service, Psalm 103:10 said, God does not deal with us according to our sins, nor repay us according to our iniquities. You don't get what you deserve, period. Now, don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying life is always easy. And I'm not saying you should be thankful for the awful things that have happened to you in life. What I am saying is that if we all got all the bad consequences for all of our bad decisions, our sins, our selfishness, it would be so much worse than it is for all of us. And I think in this moment, and maybe this change has been happening kind of off camera for a long time, but it seems like Jacob is finally starting to get it. He's finally starting to see that he is receiving mercy that he doesn't deserve. And in finally seeing mercy that he doesn't deserve applied to his life, that's what makes Jacob start changing. He didn't get it the first time. God showed him in the desert. God showed him with the vision of the ladder and the promise of all these blessings and good things that are going to come to him and saying, I'm asking nothing of you in return. And he didn't get it. Again, maybe that just makes Jacob more identifiable. Or makes it easier for us to identify with him. How many of us were the same? For those of us who are Christians in the room, think about it. How many of us can look back at our lives before God opened our eyes to His kindness and love and say, man, I missed a lot of signs. How did I not see God's goodness before He finally opened my eyes? Jacob leaves his interaction with Laban. There's some other stuff that happens that we're going to fast forward through. He leaves his interaction with Laban, kind of goes off a little bit, and he says to himself, it sure seems like he says to himself, if God is with me, maybe it's time I start acting like it. And so he sends messengers to his brother Esau. He says, it's time for me to actually face what I've done. And he keeps moving forward. He keeps going in the direction that God has told him to go, even when he hears news that Esau is coming with 400 armed men with him. And while Jacob's old instincts might take over a little bit in that he sends some strategic gifts and some messengers with kind of honeyed words for Esau, he keeps going. Jacob doesn't run. He doesn't flee. He doesn't wait until he can amass more power or arrange a better position from which to manipulate. Instead, he prays. Let's read chapter 32, verses 9 through 12. And Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred, that I may do you good. I am not worthy of the least of all these deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. For with only my staff I crossed this Jordan, and now I have become two camps. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he may come and attack me, the mothers with the children. But you said, I will surely do you good, and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for its multitude. He's starting to get it, man. He says, God, I am not worthy of the faithfulness that you have shown me. I am afraid. Help. Keep your promises even if I don't deserve it. And in this prayer, we see a reflection when he mentions the two camps, that Jacob has just made the first unselfish decision that we know of in his life. Because he sent his wives and his children behind him with a second camp with a lot of the rideable animals, forsaking the you're going to kill me in front of the women and children manipulation card that he could have held on to. He instead sends all of them back far enough away so that if Esau attacks and kills his front party, his forward party, they will have time to begin fleeing back towards Haran to perhaps reach Laban in safety. And when he sends them back, that leaves him alone, waiting. And in his aloneness, God shows up. We get this story of God coming and wrestling with Jacob, and we don't have time to go into every detail of it. But one poet said that this is what Jacob had been doing spiritually his entire life, made manifest in reality. That Jacob had been trying to manipulate and cajole and figure out his way toward his preferred outcomes for decades. He had been wrestling with everyone around him and with God for decades, trying to make things end up the way he wanted them to. But he had always ultimately been wrestling with God over leadership of his own life. And so God, in his mercy, like the image of the stars that he gave to Abraham last week, gives Jacob a visual representation of his promises, of what has been going on. God could effortlessly defeat Jacob in their wrestling contest. We see that when God merely touches him and Jacob receives a limp that will follow him for the rest of his life. And yet, God condescends to allow Jacob to work out his wrestling, to get to the end of himself, and realize that his only hope the whole way along, the last thing he says is, I will not let go of you until you bless me. He gives Jacob time to realize there was only one thing that really mattered in life, that he should have been chasing the whole time, for God's blessing. And God doesn't take away Jacob's responsibility. He renames him Israel, and he says, I am renaming you Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. But even in that, there's a reminder, because we talked about the meaning of names before, and Israel means God strives. God is telling Jacob, you know, Jacob, you've been working and you've been striving, you've been trying to make things work out your way your entire life. And that's not always a bad thing, to be working, to be striving, but you need to remember that God is the one who did the work that matters. That God's striving is the thing that secures you the future, is the thing that secures the promises that your life is based on. It is God who has chosen you and walked with you and guided you and held you in the palm of his hand through all your successes and all your failures the whole time. And when God leaves in Genesis 32:30, Jacob says, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. Brothers and sisters, like Jacob, we all have a bit of the manipulator in us. The person who says, I'm the one who matters, that mine is the plan which must succeed. I read in a novel once that a person's most treasured possessions are their illusions, the places where we have managed to deceive even ourselves. And here in Jacob, we see that a huge part of following God is about learning the lesson that Jacob learned here. Learning that we do not deserve to see God face to face, that our sin and our selfishness should wall us off from him. And yet, through what Jesus has done for us, paying the price for our little and big manipulations and deceits and sins, through the love and the faithfulness of God, God has striven. God has done the work that needed to be done to allow us to be in a right relationship with him again, to allow for our lives to be delivered. So our big application for this one is just, can we let go of the game a little bit more every day in our lives? Can we let go of trying to prove our own worth, maybe to ourselves more than anyone else? Can we come before our God and realize, like Jacob did, I am not worthy of all the least of these deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that God has shown me, but God, please deliver me.